After spending more than 3 decades on death row, David Joseph Pitman was executed in Florida. Strapped to a gurney, witnesses watching, and with his final breath, he made one last claim that changed how many people saw the case. He said the state was about to end the life of an innocent man. That alone would be unsettling. But what makes this story harder to ignore is what wasn't found. No murder weapon, no blood evidence, no fingerprints placing him at the scene. Yet 3 people were gone, a house was burned to the ground, and the verdict never changed. So how did a case filled with missing pieces still end in the ultimate punishment? Because the night those lives were lost wasn't just violent, it was layered with old accusations, family secrets, and a fire meant to erase everything. And what investigators uncovered in the ashes only raised more questions. This is the story of what really happened that night, and why, even after his execution, the case refuses to feel finished. Just after 2:30 in the morning, David Pitman stepped out of his house and started walking. The streets were quiet, no witnesses, no rush, just a half-mile stretch that would take him about 13 minutes to cross. He told himself he only wanted to talk. One conversation, a chance to straighten things out before everything collapsed. But somewhere along that short walk, the truth crept in. This wasn't going to end with words. The destination wasn't random, it was the home of his soon-to-be ex-family-in-law, the same house where his children had been staying, and the same family he'd been fighting with for months. Divorce papers, threats, and resentment had already poisoned everything. And hanging over it all was something older. An accusation from years earlier that had resurfaced and reopened wounds that never healed. It had cost him his marriage, his reputation, and any sense of control he still had. By the time he reached the house, the decision had already been made. He didn't knock on the front door. He climbed the fence, moved along the backyard, and approached the window instead. And that choice, how he entered that house, would change everything that followed. When the window tapped, she woke up confused, not terrified. At first, nothing felt explosive. He came across calm, almost reasonable. He sat down and started talking about family problems, about how everything had spun out of control and how he felt pushed into a corner. For a moment, it sounded like exactly what he claimed it was, just a conversation. But then he steered it somewhere else. Back to an allegation from years earlier. One he refused to let go of. She reminded him of what really happened, of how young she'd been, and why it could never be brushed aside the way he wanted. That's when the tone shifted. He stopped listening and started probing. Questioning her stability, picking at her personal struggles. Twisting the story until it sounded like everyone else was the problem. Then he crossed a line completely, asking for something that should have never been on the table. She said no, clearly, repeatedly. He kept pushing anyway, trying to bargain, trying to wear her down, refusing to accept the answer in front of him. And when she finally told him to leave, the calm vanished. She tried to scream, and in that split second, the night took a turn no one inside that house could undo. The moment she tried to scream, panic took over. He lunged forward, clamping a hand over her mouth, desperate to stop the sound before it carried through the house. What followed happened in seconds. The struggle was violent and chaotic, not planned or controlled. A single strike turned into something far worse, and once it started, it didn't stop. The room went quiet again, but only because it was already over. That silence didn't last. The noise had been enough to wake her mother. She rushed down the hallway, moving toward the bedroom, not knowing what she was about to walk into. She never had a chance to understand what was happening before she was attacked too. By then, her father was awake. He ran for the phone, trying to call for help, trying to do the one thing that could have stopped it. He didn't make it. In just a few minutes, 3 people were gone. And standing alone in that house, David knew one thing for certain. Running wouldn't save him, not yet, because what he did next wasn't about escape. It was about erasing everything. He didn't rush out of the house. Instead, he slowed down. If anyone was going to believe this was an accident, the scene had to say it was. That meant fire, something sudden, something destructive enough to swallow every mistake. He went to the shed and found a gasoline can. Then he came back inside and started pouring fuel through the house, room by room. In the bedroom, he dragged an old tire under the bed, knowing it would burn hotter and longer than anything else in the house. And then, as the air filled with the sharp smell of gasoline, he did something chilling. He washed himself off in the bathroom. Blood gone, hands clean, time taken. When he finished, he carried the gas can outside, tossed it into the back of the car parked in the driveway, and took the keys. Then he went back one last time and lit the fire. Flames spread fast. Within seconds, the house was burning, and he was already gone, disappearing into the dark while the fire did exactly what it was meant to do. Or so he thought, because within minutes, someone else would see the flames tearing into the sky. And once firefighters stepped inside, the fire would start telling a story of its own. The flames were spotted almost immediately. A delivery driver saw fire climbing high above the house and called it in. By the time crews arrived, the home was already being eaten from the inside out. Firefighters battled it for nearly half an hour. Part of the roof collapsed. Another section blew apart with a sharp, explosive crack that neighbors would later remember clearly. When the main fire finally died down, what was left looked exactly like what an accident was supposed to look like. Until they started searching, the fire had started in the living room, right at the center of the house. But one bedroom burned hotter than the rest. The damage there was extreme. The floor was gone, the ceiling had caved in. And under the bed, firefighters found something that didn't belong. A car tire. It acted like a torch, feeding the flames longer and harder than anything else in the house. That wasn't random, it was deliberate. Then came the discovery that changed everything. Inside the ruins were 3 bodies. And the fire hadn't taken their lives. The medical examiner found no smoke in their lungs. No signs they'd breathed during the blaze. Each of them had fatal injuries that happened before the flames ever started. The fire hadn't destroyed the truth. It had exposed it, and by the time the sun came up, investigators realized the destruction hadn't stopped with that house. By sunrise, investigators had another fire to deal with. Less than a mile from the burned house, a brown Toyota was spotted sitting awkwardly in a ditch, like it had been abandoned in a hurry. Not long after, smoke started pouring into the air. A worker nearby watched as the car suddenly went up in flames. A neighbor saw it too, and noticed a man running away from the scene just moments later. When police later showed her a lineup, she didn't hesitate. She picked the same person out immediately. The message was clear. This wasn't bad luck or coincidence. It was a pattern. Detectives quickly tied the burning car back to the house fire. Another attempt to wipe away evidence. Another mistake that only narrowed the focus. And now, they knew exactly who they were looking for. The pressure built fast. Within a day, David Pitman realized there was nowhere left to hide. At his mother's urging, he turned himself in. But even behind bars, the story didn't stop growing. Because while police were still searching for proof, David started talking. And what he said to another inmate would become one of the most damaging pieces of the case. Even so, when investigators went looking for hard evidence, they came up empty. On paper, the case looked solid. Threats had been made, motive was clear, and David had allegedly described the crime in detail to a fellow inmate while behind bars. But when investigators tried to back it up with hard proof, the case started to feel thinner than anyone expected. There was no murder weapon. Despite extensive searches, the knife was never found. Fingerprints pulled from the burned car didn't match his. His clothes showed no blood, no burns, nothing that placed him inside a house engulfed in flames just hours earlier. For a crime that violent, the lack of physical evidence was glaring. The prosecution leaned heavily on witness statements, his strained relationship with the family, and the accusation from years earlier that had recently resurfaced. They painted a picture of a man pushed to the edge, acting out of rage and desperation. The defense pushed back, arguing that suspicion wasn't the same as proof. That stories passed through inmates and memories shaped by fear weren't enough to end a man's life. But juries don't just weigh evidence. They weigh narratives. And by the time the verdict came back, doubt wasn't enough. David Pitman was found guilty on nearly every charge. And then the focus shifted to a different question entirely. Not whether he did it, but whether he deserved to die for it. When the trial moved into sentencing, the defense changed strategies. They weren't trying to erase what had happened anymore. They were trying to explain it. David's mother took the stand and described a childhood filled with constant beatings. Belts, broom handles, anything within reach. She said it happened almost daily. Sometimes every single day. At one point, she admitted to forcing him to sit on a bench for an entire week as punishment, threatening worse if anyone tried to intervene. Then the expert spoke. A psychologist told the court David suffered from severe attention disorders, brain damage, and extreme mood instability. His father had lived with paranoid schizophrenia and died in an institution. A half-brother struggled with the same illness. Tests showed David's intelligence was average, but his memory ranked worse than nearly everyone else tested. Add alcohol, stress, and years of instability, the defense argued, and he could have lost touch with reality entirely that night. It didn't matter. Prosecutors pointed to the planning, the fires, and the attempts to cover everything up. To them, this wasn't confusion. It was cruelty. When the jury voted, the decision wasn't unanimous, but it was enough. They recommended death, and the judge agreed. The sentence was finalized. David Joseph Pitman would die for what happened inside that house. But the story didn't end there. Because for the next 3 decades, he fought the sentence every way he could. And in the end, time was the only thing he had left. For the next 32 years, David Pitman sat on death row as appeal after appeal failed. Judges upheld the verdict. The sentence never changed, and eventually, a date was set. On the morning of his execution, he woke up under the same lights that had marked every other day behind bars. Hours later, he ate his final meal in silence, knowing there were no arguments left to make. Just before 6 p.m., he was strapped down and asked if he had any final words. He didn't hesitate. He said the state of Florida was about to end the life of an innocent man. That he didn't kill anyone. And then he said nothing more. Minutes later, it was over. 3 people were gone. A man was executed. And the case was closed, at least on paper. But the questions never fully disappeared. No weapon, no physical evidence. A conviction built on motive, testimony, and a story the jury believed was complete enough. So the real question isn't just whether the state followed the law. It's whether certainty was ever truly reached. And if justice depends on being absolutely sure. Was this enough?